Hello and welcome everyone on the Information Technology and Service Management PECB webinars. My name is Vler Shala, the PECB organizer of this webinar, and today's topic is winning approach towards successful ISO 20000 certification. This webinar is going to be presented by Mr. Steve Tremblay, Senior ITSM consultant, trainer at ExcelsaTech, and PECB certified trainer. Please write your question and comments in the question box in the right hand control panel, or you may use the option to raise your hand and Mr. Steve will answer to them accordingly. Please, Mr. Steve, you may start the presentation.
Thank you very much. Once again, welcome everyone to this webinar. I would like to start to confirm that today I'm not going to give you the exact winning strategy to be able to know how best to implement 20,000, but I'm certainly going to try to give you some pointers, highlight some areas of the standard that is important to know about and to consider. I will go as well and cover some of the critical steps as well for any organization or any person or group of people that are considering to pursue, again, meeting the requirements of the ISO/IEC 20000 standard. So this is the agenda that I'll be covering over the next about 45 minutes. Trying to keep a good 10 to 15 minutes at the end as much as possible to allow you all to be able to ask questions that would be focused on the subject here and that I could answer to provide you some more insights. So I'll start because I have like a diverse attendance. Some people are maybe quite familiar with 20,000, some a little bit less familiar. So I'll go with a review of the different parts of 20,000 because I found that over the years, a lot of people know about the ISO/IEC 20000-1, which is the standard that has the requirements. That's our normative standard, but there are other parts. And we're working, in fact, on the review constantly of those parts and adding as well different parts. So I'll go over that in a few minutes. Then I'll switch to that part one, so the requirement standard, and the brief overview of the clauses that are included and what's in those clauses. The next subject that I want to touch is some important and critical terms and concepts part of the standard as well. So you see them listed on this agenda here. So top management, governance, the service management plan, and the three other ones as well. So I'll have a slide on each one of them to highlight their importance and how they should really be considered when you want to become potentially an organization that will be certified with ISO 20000. And then lastly, I want to touch on the scope definition, because that's a critical part in order to achieve certification as well. The scope is what will define to some degree the effort that we will need as an organization to put in place to achieve certification. So the smaller the scope, the easier the mandate to achieve certification could be. The more complex the scope, the more complex the achievement will be as well. And then, as I mentioned, I'll still touch some the important steps really on how or that should be taken on how to proceed when you want to meet the requirements of the standards. So that's in a nutshell what I'm going to be covering over the next about 40 minutes. Again, if you have questions, if you want to note them, and then ask them at the end. If you want, you could also, I believe, send them into the chat, and then we'll be touching those questions after I finish the presentation, trying to cover as many as possible. And rest assured that if some questions are not answered, because there's potentially more than the time that will be available, we will be able to respond back to you by email. So that is not a problem as well. We've done that on other webinars where I replied to some of the people that the questions weren't answered. So at least this individual that asked the question will get his or her answer. Won't benefit everyone that was attending, but at least the person that asked the question will have an answer. So let's start with the different parts of the ISO/IEC 20000. So you have to understand that this is a series of standards. So what we have right now that is published are the ones that we have on that slide here. So everyone here should be aware of part 1, which is, as I mentioned before, our service management system requirements. So that's where we have all the requirements that an organization must meet in order to be certified. Now, these are the shall statement as we hear often on the market. These are the what needs to be there. Part 2 is the guidance on the application of that service management system, our SMS. So part 2 is a guide on how to achieve the part 1 requirements. So that means that in part 2, what we have is explanatory text for each of the requirements of part 1. So every one of those requirements is elaborated in part 2 and provided some guidance as well on how to achieve it, examples and so on. Part 3 is the guidance for an organization to be able to define the applicability of that standard, ISO 20000-1, and how to also define a specific scope that will be suitable for your organization. So the whole part is only on those 2 subjects. Now, it does touch some other areas as well. When we talk about scoping and we talk about applicability, there is some relationship to governance, control of the processes and so on. So that also is touched in part 3. So there's a little bit of further explanation as well on these concepts there. Part 4 is what we call our process reference model. And I want to highlight at this point, getting to part 4, that right now we have current versions, part 1 that was published in 2011, and then the associated part 2 that was published the following year, and the part 3 as well that is in line with these 2 first standards. Part 4 is one part that was done while part 1 was in 2005 edition. So right now it's not fully aligned to part 1 because part 1 is 2011 edition. So there are some changes that were brought in when we wrote part 1 and published it in 2011. So part 4 was used in cooperation with another committee at ISO, specifically to work at defining a process assessment model. So a process assessment model is a tool that we would use to define the capabilities of processes. And in this case, part 4 was used to define a process assessment model that would assess the capabilities of the processes of the ISO 20000 standard. So the processes that are in scope are covered under that process assessment model that is been developed, ultimately would be released. But right now it's not released as of yet. As I mentioned, the part 4 wasn't adapted. So we have a version that was prepared for a process assessment model, but it needs to be redone to align to the current version. And this is not done within the work of ISO 20000 as well. This is done, as I mentioned, under another committee at ISO. For your information, these standards that I'm referring to that aligns with our part 4 is from the series that is a 15504, which when they get to be published, because we're going to have some that will be published starting in 2016, will be in fact under the series number 33000. So we started with a 15504 several years ago. There are already some standards under that series, but we're also reviewing them, and then they're going to be all renumbered under the 33000 series because the scope of that series have grown quite a bit, including the processes of 20000, but the processes as well of the security management standard 27001 and so on. So there's a lot of those process assessment model that will be coming out over the next several years. So one thing to keep definitely in sight if you're involved with 20000 or other type of management systems as well. Part 5 is an exemplar implementation plan for the ISO 20000-1. So what we have in part 5 is a method that is suggested for organizations that wants to achieve certification, with a method as well from an implementation plan. So we have a model that is defined there within that part, and we're explaining on how best to proceed to initiate a project and to manage that project onto completion, which would then translate to achieving the certification, or at the least meeting the requirements that as an organization we decided that we wanted to meet, if the goal was to meet the requirements or a subset of the requirements, but not necessarily to certify. Keep in mind that with these standards, I mean, an organization has a choice. We could meet the standard entirely, we could meet it partially, and we could also choose to be certified. And if we choose to be certified, then we have to meet the requirements of the standard entirely in the case of 20,000. Part 9 was published this year, and it's a guidance on, as it says here, the application of the ISO 20000 to cloud services. So this guidance is to help organizations that have a certification already on 20,000 and that are starting to use more and more cloud services types. And so how do you adapt your SMS, your service management system, to the environment of a cloud service type of environment? So that's what Part 9 is about. It helps as well if we are in the process as well of trying to achieve the certification of 20,000 and have to consider that we may use already cloud services. So then we have the proper guidance here to help us to do that well. Part 10 is what we call the concept and terminology. That part, in fact, is quite recent as well. We published that part 2 years ago. And that part does what? Well, it does define all the concepts, terms and definitions that are used within the series of 20,000 standards. It does as well introduce every single part of the series as well. And one other aspect that it does cover as well is the interdependencies between the parts and interdependencies between the series and other standards, such as ISO 9001, ISO 27001, ISO 15504 for those parts of those standards that are to assess the capability of processes, and so on. So there's many other standards that are closely related with ISO 20000, and Part 10 details these at a high level and discuss on how they have influence or how they might be required to be used in cooperation with 20,000. So that's quite of an important part, in fact, that I would recommend anyone to go and have a look at. Now, one thing interesting with Part 10, I have to mention that I am the main editor of Part 10. I'm also editor for Part 1 right now, and I'll touch on that when I get to conclude that presentation, because we just started this year the review of Part 1. So Part 10 is a free standard. So if you go to ISO.org and you do a search on free standards, you should be able to find a page where there's multiple free standards. So not all the ISO standards have to be purchased. Some of them are distributed freely, and Part 10 is one of them. So if you found that page, you could go and download the Part 10 concept and terminology free of charge. And if your organization that is starting on that path to achieve certification with 20,000 or to use 20,000 to guide your process definition and development, I would say that looking at Part 10 is quite valuable. Now, to just elaborate as well on the parts of 20,000 and how it's coming, these are the ones that are published, as I mentioned. But the series has 15 parts that are planned. We have one that is Part 6 that is going to be published within about a year, and it's the requirements for bodies that are providing audits of that standard, 20,000. So how should they approach auditing that standard to certify an organization? Each standard has some differences. And although there's guidance, standards that you could look, such as 19011 or 17021, that guides auditors on how to do that job. When you audit a standard that is 9001 versus 27001 or 20,000 or some other ones, 14,001 in environment, there are some nuance that has to be known by the auditors. And so part six is going to help the auditors to understand those differences that have to be considered. Part 8 is a reserved number at this point. We were considering potentially writing something that pertains to the achievement of the standard relating to organizations that what we call very small enterprises. Because although those standards applies to multiple type of organization, multiple sizes, if you're a small organization, it's always a little bit more of a challenge. So we're planning to write a white paper produced by ISO that will guide smaller organizations on how to manage to achieve the standard certification as well. Part 11 is going to be published, we expect, beginning of 2016, if we're lucky, even maybe before the end of this year. And it's a standard that discusses the relationships and interdependencies or similarities or differences between ISO 20000 and the ITIL best practices. Part 12 will do the same thing, but between 20000 and CMMI. Part 13 will do the same thing between 20000 and COBIT 5. So 3 parts, 11, 12, 13, that will help organization again to understand better on potentially how to use standards such as 20000 and best practices that exist on the market that touches as well these similar processes. Part 14 is a reserved standard as well, which potentially is going to be assigned to another type of comparison with another set of best practices. We're not sure yet on what we're going to be covering. And part 15, the last one we have in the series that is planned or scheduled, is one part that will treat the subject of service trustworthiness. So again, the whole idea behind 20000 is the service management system that will enable the delivery, maintenance, operation of services for the business to enable the business to achieve business outcomes. So there's that aspect of a service provider there. So part 15 will treat about that subject. So this is really what we call the ISO/IEC 20000 series. So as you could see, there's a lot more than part 1 and part 2 and part 3 that people may be more familiar with. And I would strongly recommend that, yes, consider looking at the other parts that you see here on that slide and keep an eye on what's coming as well. So now a brief overview of what we have within part 1, so that standard that we have right now in place, so where we have our requirements. So you have here the layout of the standard. If you work with other standards, there's some things that are quite common within each of the standards. First clause that provide the scope of the standard itself, the normative references that are always in clause 2, and then clause 3 that when terms are required and definitions, that's where we have them. And in 20000 right now, we have a clause 3 that has the terms and definitions. So the definitions of terms that we use in the series in a way that might be slightly different than what we may get from a dictionary or from what we may get from the mother quality standard, which is the 9001, and more specifically 9000, which has all the definition of quality management systems specific terms. One thing to point out as well here is that right now, you saw that we have part 10 that is also about the concepts of terms and definitions. And we have in part 1 terms and definitions as well. So at the moment, what we have in part 10 is the exact terms and definition as we have in part 1. And that is because, well, the part is published since 2011, and we cannot, well, just modify it as easily as that. So it's under review right now. And the goal for the series is that none of the parts will have terms and definitions included in it. They will all refer to part 10, and part 10 that will always remain free as well of charge. So that means that this will then be available to anyone that needs to work with one or the other of the parts of the series. So additional value there for the consumers for sure. And right now, as we're reviewing the other parts that had some terms and definitions, they're removed as well, and they're included in Part 10. Part 10 is one standard, and in fact, we're reviewing on a yearly basis. As normal standards, such as the Part 1, you could be, in fact, as you could see, 7 years without having a new standard, because this one was published in 2011, and now we're planning a new version for 2018. So next clause here, clause 4, where we discuss the service management system general requirements. So that is the requirements for generic, as we see it here, that are specifically for the implementation, the definition, the implementation, and the operation of that service management system that we need to have in place to ensure that we will then be able to manage, deliver, maintain, support those services to the business. Clause 5 is for the design and transition of new or change services. So what we have there is processes such as planning the new or change services, the designing of those new or change services, and as well the transition of those new or change services. So a quite extensive clause, a lot of requirements in that clause as well. But then we get to 4 next clauses where a lot of people are a lot more familiar with, because we're going down to something or some processes that are extensively used in the multiple set of best practices. So clause 6 with the service delivery processes, processes such as service level management, service reporting, service continuity and availability, budgeting and accounting for services, capacity management, and information security management as well. So these are all the processes and their associated requirements within that clause. So it's a fairly long clause as well. As you can see, there's a lot of processes included in it. Clause 7 talks about and covers the relationship processes. So we're talking about the business relationship management and the supplier management processes. And again, for those 2 processes, the requirements that an organization should have in place or shall have in place in order to meet the standard and be certified. Clause 8 touches the resolution processes. So that is incident and service request management and the problem management process. And then same idea there, the requirements of those 2 processes. And lastly, clause 9 is all about control processes. So that's configuration management, change management, and the release and deployment management process. So again, requirements for each one of those 3 processes. So in a nutshell, that's what you have in the standard. So if you worked and you're new to ISO 20000, but you've worked with best practices, you can see here from the list of those processes that comparison to, let's say, ITIL processes, it's a subset of the processes that you have in ITIL. So we don't cover all of the ITIL processes. You may have noticed that some of the processes as well in the standard here have been combined. Availability and continuity management, and incident and service request management. Slight differences, doesn't change really much in the end, as long as the activities that are required are in place, are executed, whether it's a combined process or 2 processes, in the end the results are pretty much the same. Keep in mind that we're talking about a standard here, so the requirements are not as extensive as what you may see as statements in a set of best practices such as ITIL, which is a lot more elaborated and in fact includes, to that degree, if we could say, by extension, pretty much part 2, which of 20000, which is our guide within the series here, but again in scope of the processes that we're covering. So a set of best practices like ITIL or even COBIT goes with some recommendations of what should be in place, but also on how to achieve that. So which we do here in 2 standards. Part 1, that is what would need to be achieved, and that's the minimum requirements to be certified, and part 2 on how to best achieve these. So now let's look at some of those critical important terms or concepts that I mentioned to you while I covered the agenda. So, and I wanted to cover these six subjects here because they are different, and sometimes people may have different perceptions on what they mean exactly. And if you go to meet the certification, the requirements of 20,000 and achieve the certification, well, you have to understand some of these here for sure, and that will make it a lot easier. So let's start with top management. Top management, again, we didn't really reinvent the wheel. You see the definition from the first statement here: person or group of people who direct and control the service provider at the highest level. So when you read that, you should understand that then top management is not within the service provider. If you talk about an IT service provider, then that top management is above that organization. And so that, again, at least helps you to situate where that would fit in an overall organization. And since I am here talking about a first definition of one term here, or concept, I want to highlight something as well that you may not all of you have noticed. If you've worked with ISO 20000 with its previous edition, 2005, we were talking about IT service management. Now, we made a choice when we reviewed 2005 edition and produced the 2011 to remove the IT and go generic as service management. So when we talk about any concepts in 20,000, we talk about service management concepts, which in turn allows the standard to apply to IT organization, so to an IT service provider organization, but could apply as well to any type of service provider. And to that degree, there are already many organizations that are not IT service provider organizations that have certified themselves, their organization, with ISO 20000. So again, that special term that we use is important to our standard, our series. It is used in 9000 as well, and also describes those that are responsible for the organization. So we're not changing the definition. We're really applying it as the mother quality statement, quality standard, that is ISO 9001, or the definition of terms that are included in ISO 9000 are defining it as well. And that is essential to get, in fact, the exact direction and support that the service provider will need to have to define and implement, maintain, and improve that SMS that will, again, enable the delivery of those services that we need to do for our business. So a quite important term to know about here. Now, governance. Governance has many definitions. One within ISO that, again, is quite important as a definition comes from the series that is the 38500. 38500 is a series that we've defined that deals specifically with governance, IT governance specifically. So here we're using governance in a slightly different way than just from the word itself. The way that we're using it is, as you say here, in a context of governance of processes operated by other parties. And we make that difference within the 20,000 because that's the only way, the only perspective that we're using the word governance. And that applies for clauses 5 to 9, which, as you saw before, describes the multiple processes that are specific processes that are part of the SMS. And for any of these processes, it is possible that a service provider outsource these to another service provider, a supplier, an external party, or potentially to even an internal group or a customer to that degree as well. So that's why we have the definition of governance of processes operated by other parties. Because as you can see here, clause 4, which are the generic requirements of the SMS, cannot be outsourced, at least at this point. They need to be maintained by the service provider that wants to reach the certification. But then any of the processes within clause 5 or 9 could be outsourced. So one of the requirements within the 20,000 is that although you may outsource a process, you have to keep the governance of that process that will be operated by another party. And that's the concept of governance that is quite critical and specific to 20,000. And there's also a limit as well to the number of processes that you would go and outsource. As an example, and if we go to an extreme, if you outsource all of the processes of clause 5 to 9, and it's to one single supplier, well, that supplier should potentially be the ones fully certified ISO 20000 and support your organization entirely. So that would be a type of different situation. What we assume here in 20,000 is that only a part, maybe up to half of those processes could potentially be outsourced in a normal organization where we still would want to have our own certification. And in that case, then you have to make sure that you maintain that governance within your organization, that is the service provider that will be certified. Service management plan, again, an essential part here of really implementing an SMS. That is a major endeavor. It is a major project that will be requiring a lot of effort, and once implemented, will continue to evolve and move over time, that SMS, so it needs to be properly orchestrated. And you could see that I listed some clauses, in fact, that really highlight the importance of that service management plan. So 4.3.1, where we have a requirement where that plan must be documented. That plan from 4.5.5.1 has or shall include a description as well of the scope of the SMS. So we have to be able to relate to the plan and what we have in place, and it has to match. So from a scope perspective, it has to be exactly the same thing. 4.5.2 specifies that the plan shall be created, implemented, and maintained. So that's not just a plan that we create and we put on a shelf once we know what we need to do when we go on with that. No, it's a living plan, and it needs to be implemented as it was created, but it needs to be maintained as well as the SMS would evolve over time. And then within that clause, we also state some elements of the plans that needs to be in place. So if you go in the standard, you could have that additional guidance as well of what would be required at the minimum as well. And as I mentioned, it's elaborated as from how to achieve these within the part 2. It also states, as you can see here on the last statement for clause 4.5.2, that those plans could be developed as well for specific processes. And if they are, that means a lower level of details, they have to fully align with the service management plan at the top level for the SMS. And then finally, clause 4.5.3, will specify that the plan shall be used through the whole life cycle of the SMS. So that's from design to, as I mentioned, when we looked at improving that SMS as well over time. So the plan would always remain aligned to the SMS based on how the SMS needs to evolve over time. Resources. Again, we use resources as it's commonly defined. So when we talk about resources, it's really all types of resources, whether we're talking about human, technical, information, or financial types. Again, they need to be defined, they need to be established and implemented in order to maintain our SMS and the services as well that will be part of that SMS, so what we're delivering to our customers. And they need to be as well assessed and confirmed on how they need to evolve over time. So constantly improved to make sure that we have the highest level of effectiveness, and that secondly, that it would also drive that enhanced customer satisfaction over time. And that enhanced customer satisfaction is what is bringing us to look at continually improving that SMS, and in this case, improving as well those resources that will be used. So as an example, if we go with the type of resource that is human resources, that means, well, at all time, we have the right number of those resources working in each of our organization with the right competencies and skills as well. That also means that we have the proper onboarding process that includes the proper training for new human resources joining in, or the proper training program as well for people that are within the organization, but that may change role within the SMS as well. So that has to be all in place. A service management policy. We saw before top management. So again, top management is providing the direction to the service provider and will help us to define exactly the definition and implementation on how we need to get that in place, that SMS and its services. The policy, the service management policy, is what's going to be able to ensure that the proper guidance is communicated and communicated at all time as well, and then will allow us to be able to also measure that it's met or not, or will it's met or not over time, and then potentially trigger changes on our SMS, on our services, which will turn into improving constantly over time our model. So again, appropriate to the purpose of the service provider. So those policies have to be in line with what we have as a direction and what we're trying to achieve. The commitment that we will fulfill the service requirements. So it has to go to the basis of the setting up of the SMS, which are those service requirements. The aspect of continually improving, as I mentioned before, the framework for the reviewing of the objectives. So how we're going to be able to also measure that we meet those statements in those policies and ultimately meet the direction that is provided by top management. And then, as I mentioned, well, they need to be communicated, they need to be explained so that they're fully understood by all people that are involved within the SMS. And then these same policies, as we do evolve the SMS, well, they're part of the SMS, they need to also be evolving and be reviewed so that they're continually aligning as well. So important concepts for definitely an implementation of an SMS here based on, as we see, the 20,000 standard. One other area here that I wanted to cover is the authority, responsibility, and communication. Again, top management provide that direction at the very top, and then within the service provider, we have that direction and we have to implement that SMS and services in order to meet business needs. That means that some people will need to receive authorities. Some people will be assigned roles, and those roles will have responsibilities. And that we have to make sure that it's properly communicated. So if we don't communicate it, it's not going to work. It's not going to work well. People are not going to know exactly what they should be doing, and that's not the ideal situation. If the authority or the responsibilities are provided, but the authorities are not provided as well that are required, then we're not going to be able to execute our responsibilities as well as we should. So it is important, again, that the roles are aligned with the authorities that are assigned to those roles, and that the proper level of authorities as well are assigned so that people are powered with all of what they need to take action when they need to take action, or to make the right decisions to trigger those actions that are required. So that's an important concept here. You don't want to have all of that authority at the top management level. And you don't necessarily want to have all the authority as well just delegated to the top level of the service provider. So at any level that some level of authority is required, you want to make sure that it goes down to that level, and that will be properly defined, documented, and communicated so that it is working well. Okay, so these were, again, 6 terms/concepts that I wanted to cover and make sure that, either you refresh with these, either it will highlight a little bit more importance from your perspective, and now will trigger maybe you going back and reading again the standard and make sure that you do look at these properly within your SMS that may exist already and potentially improve, or if you're just about to use the standard to maybe help your organization or some client organizations to achieve it, that you know exactly on how to approach it. Now let's look at the definition of your scope. So I have a bit of information here on first the applicability and secondly on the scope itself specifically. So within part 3, what I mentioned before is that that part 3 of the series talks about that specifically. So it does talk in the first subject as the applicability of the standard. So a standard is not for any organization or every organization. So the first thing that we need to do as an organization is to look at the applicability of the standard to our own organization and as well to our own organization within the extended view as well. So that's us, that's our suppliers, that's our internal groups, customers, and so on. So we have to look on if the standard applies to us as we operating or planning to operate. It is possible that we define that yes, it does, and then we could then proceed scoping our project and looking at achieving the certification. But it is possible as well, as you could see on that slide, that in fact we can or we could meet some of the requirements, we can fulfill them, but not all of the requirements. So then maybe another standard is more suitable for our own organization, maybe 9001, maybe a specific standard such as 27001 if in fact our needs are more from a information security perspective and not so much from a service management, a full-blown service management perspective. Or it could be as well that in fact the certification is not what we're looking at or should be looking at, but at least the achievement of a subset of those requirements of the standard. So you have to look at that when you want or you consider defining an SMS and achieving potentially the certification. So how does it apply to you as an organization? And then once this is done, and if it is determined that yes, it does apply to us and we want to pursue, then we can get to the definition of that scope statement for our certification. And then again, top management, as you see here, which is the top management of the service provider, should ensure that the service management plan will be created and include that scope of that SMS. And by the fact that it's going to be documented, as we saw before, and it'll be communicated and maintained, then we know that a project could spin off of this, and then the guidance of what needs to be done is clear. And I put it a little extract here as well, coming out of the part 3 about the scope definition. Just some things to highlight there, but the scope has to be as simple as much as possible, but it has to have the right information within it as well. So what is included and what are the potential exclusion as well, either from a perspective of locations, geographical location, or services potentially, or customer base as well within our organization. So again, if we're certifying under 20,000, we could to a certain degree limit the scope to a specific geographical location of the organization. We could limit it as well to a specific service or several services, or we could limit it to potentially as well a specific customer group or some customer groups and not go with the entire organization. So that's the exercise that you should be doing at the onset of looking to achieve the 20,000 certification. So really defining that and making sure it's clear. So the last couple of slides is on the meeting the requirements and a bit of guidance, high-level guidance, but still some aspects that you need to pay attention to. Vision of your project. So out of the subject which is covered with the applicability and the scoping, you can see that this is critical. We need to know why we want to do that and what we're trying to achieve. A second important step is you need to know where you are at this point in time as well. So an assessment of your current state is critical as well. You may already meet as an organization some or a lot of those requirements. So once you know that for sure you want to achieve certification, let's look at what you have right now, and then based on what would be missing between what is in the 20,000 standard and what you have, then you have your gap, and then you could plan your project with specific elements, as you could see here, going from a purpose, scope, and the users of that SMS, different reference documents, and then typical objectives of your projects. What are you expecting as results or outcomes of the projects, the deadlines, project organizations, risks, how you're going to deal with risks as well, any tools you may use as well during the project, how you're going to manage records, and then validity and document management as well. So at high level, that would be, what important steps that you should be looking at quite specifically to put you on the right track to achieve 20,000 within an acceptable level of effort. Another statement that I put at the bottom of that slide here: use other parts of ISO IEC 20,000. Part 5 is a guide, an exemplar there on how to prepare to meet the standard. Use it. Part 3 with the scoping, so it's going to help you from the applicability and the scoping perspective. Use that standard as well. Part 2 is the guide on how to achieve those requirements of Part 1. Very good help there as well to help you to better understand each of those requirements and how best to achieve them. So make a good use of those other parts. And then I wanted to include as well really a high-level kind of flow chart of the project. So going from the bottom left corner with an ISO 20,000 awareness. In any of those projects, yes, you need to have the vision, as I mentioned, it's critical, but you need to have that level of awareness of all the people that may be involved as well, so that they understand what it means and what would be the value as well to achieve that type of certification. And then you could go through the first steps that you see here that I covered on the previous slide: vision, objectives, and scope, assessing your present situation and determining your gap, detailing your plan that you need to do, so your roadmap, then getting that formally into a business case and formally approved as well, because you need to have the stakeholders, the right stakeholder support right from the beginning and all through the project as well, if you want to make sure that you're going to get to your end. Then you could establish your either program or project and training program potentially, and then looked at really the implementation of that SMS, so establishing the policies, processes, and procedures, and so on, making sure it's in place. Final assessment, so a reassessment to confirm that you did do a good job, so a confirmation that your project was successful. And then you could go and look at certifying your SMS, and that would be an external third party that would come and do that and ultimately award you that certificate. After that, well, it's not finished. You need to maintain and constantly improve that SMS. As you could see, it just drives back to the bottom, and on a yearly basis, so you're going to have those surveillance audits on your SMS by that external third party, and you're also going to have to recertify fully every 3 years. So it's a continuous process. So that is what I wanted to present to you all today. So again, 20,000, very valuable standard for organizations that wants to make sure that they do the right thing and that they deliver the right level of quality as well, so that you define the level of quality that is required and that you maintain that level of quality over time, and that as the needs change from a business side, that you could ensure that the level of quality would also adapt. So that's the minimum requirements that will allow an organization to be able to achieve this. Note that with additional best practices, you could put other things in place in supplement of the standard and potentially do even better. But this standard has been done for any type of organizations, any size, any complexity, any type of domain that they operate, so that they could meet the standard and be able to achieve this. I wanted to mention as well, I did touch it briefly at the beginning, but this standard that was published in 2011 has just started to be reviewed right now. So we started in the spring. In fact, this week I am in Copenhagen, and we have a full week of work on the ISO 20,000 standards, and more specifically reviewing a first round of comments, modifications that we've elaborated for the new version of 20,000-1 that will come. Is scheduled to be published for 2018. So as you're going that path potentially, or if you're already on that path, or if you're already certified, keep that in mind that in 2018 there will be a new edition coming out. So as you don't want to have that as a surprise, I think it's important that you know today and that you could start to think about it, and know as well that through your own country's contributors to the ISO standards, you could also bring in some perspective as well. We've conducted, I work at ISO on behalf of Canada specifically, but we've conducted within our committee responsible for the ISO 20,000 series, series of surveys in the past, and we will still do some more in the future. So that's how we get the feedback of the community as well on how the series should evolve. So if you have something that you know that could contribute, feel free to either contact me directly, or you could go through your national body, so through each of your countries, and provide that feedback as much as possible. And that's going to be contributing to making sure that what we come out with in 2018 is potentially meeting even more your needs then. So that is the end. You have my email, in fact, on that slide here. So you'll be able to access an electronic copy of that presentation as well afterwards. So you could always take it if you don't have time here to note, but very straightforward. It's my name at ExcelsaTech.com, and feel free to send me any questions as well you may have on that standard. PECB and the offering of the ISO 20000 type of training that are available to you as well. So from the foundation level to a specific training for lead implementers or lead auditors, to even an ISO 20000 master type of courses for someone that really oversees the whole thing. So work with implementers, but also auditors. So 4 good courses that if you're a provider or a partner of PECB, that you could also extend or present to your customers by extension, or if you want to have training, then training courses there that you could have access to. And who we are, to conclude here, Excelsa Technologies Consulting. So we are a partner of PECB. So we are, by extension, offering some of those courses that PECB offers. 20,000 is one part, but PECB offers more than just 20,000, as you may already know. And if you don't, I would recommend that you go to their website too. But you have a brief description on that slide here of our own company and how we work within that field of 20,000 and some other adjacent fields as well. So briefly, we work in process reengineering, and we're using multiple best practices and standards, all kind of standards that are in line with those best practices from an IT perspective, or more generically from a service management perspective. So at this point, and the remaining of the time that we have, I'm open to any questions anyone may have, or if there's already that were asked.
Thank you, Mr. Steve, for this great presentation. I can see that Mr. Harvey Berger has raised his hand. Therefore, I'm going to unmute your microphone so you can ask your questions. Mr. Harvey, I have unmuted you, so please ask your questions.
He may not have a microphone or be able to speak where he is right now. Maybe typing it.
Yeah, it looks like Harvey's microphone is not working, so we will continue with other questions. Mr. Steve, we have 2 questions. The first one is how important is to define the scope correctly?
It is critical because, and the scope should be defined right at the onset of the project, because that's going to either limit the footprint of your SMS, and if you are new to certification as an organization and you go with a fully large or full-blown scope, first of all, it may take quite a while before you manage to achieve it, and it will be a discovery process as well to be able to achieve this. So if you limit your scope to something that is a little bit more of a smaller footprint, then it's easier for an organization to achieve it. And then what you could do is following your next surveillance audits and so on, you could modify your scope as well, and then increase your scope to potentially, eventually, a full-blown scope of your organization. So it's to make it easier for organization to define. The important thing as well about the scope is that as soon as you get to define it, and as soon as you get to identify an external party to do your audit, you have to make sure that that scope will be communicated clearly as well to that third party auditor, so that they confirm the validity of your scope statement, so that as you start to then work at defining your SMS and your services, so your overall system, that you work in the right direction. so that when they come in and looked at evaluating your SMS, that they already agree that your scope was acceptable and you have no surprises. So the scoping is quite critical activity when you want to achieve the certification.
Thank you very much. The second one is how important is a training in raising of competence and awareness of the personnel?
I would say that it is very important because if we talk about certification, certifying an SMS for any type of organization, there will be an investment that is required, investment in multiple resources. People will have to take time to do that work that needs to be done to define that SMS and implement it, but also to maintain it over time. The organization will have to accept as well that that will have a cost ultimately to the organization. So you have to be able to define and justify that direction to proceed with and demonstrate the benefits. And if you do that to people that don't really understand what is ISO 20000, what it does, what it can do, and how it can benefit, then it's really going to be difficult to sell that. So the best thing is to raise the awareness of the general stakeholders that needs to have it, that needs to have that type of information, and then focus on specific training on the stakeholders that will be involved at different degree of the SMS. Again, we saw the 4 different types of courses. If we're going to work only during the implementation, and we've never done it, well, some training on how to best implement could be something that would be valuable. If I'm an internal auditor and I will be doing internal audits before we have our surveillance audit done by a third party, external party, I need to understand the particularities of the ISO 20000 as well. So an auditor type of training on ISO 20000 could be valuable as well to make sure that we do a good job. And then when we do internally, and then when we get our surveillance audit done by a third party, we have no surprises. It goes smooth, it goes quick, and we don't have any corrections to do because we have a good system in place. So very important to have the right level of knowledge or awareness of the 20000 before you proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Steve. We don't have other questions. I just want to thank you again for this very informative presentation. Also, I want to thank all attendees as well for taking the time out of your busy schedules and join us. We hope you enjoyed this webinar, and you can check PECB's webinar schedule in our website www.pecb.com. Just let to inform you that next Tuesday we are hosting a webinar on topic RISE management in IT services. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.